I do want to ask you a first preliminary question on frames. You use three words that are sort of curious. You prefer security over peace, for example, or you prefer hegemony. That is, I'm Italian. I read Gramsci, and I know where it comes from. Over governance, for example. So there are some intellectual markers that somehow come up. When you speak about unity instead of cooperations, you clearly make some reference. So I was wondering if you could address in a way self-reflectively for a moment why these three frames, why in a way bringing together the book through these three frames.
Okay, I'll answer this and then perhaps we could take groups of questions. I think it's a very good question. First of all, I use security because I wanted to capture human security and development as well. The chapter on the UN also looks at socio-economic issues and goes into a lot of detail in terms of the inequalities embedded in the system of the World Bank and IMF and the African debt crisis, and really taking on issues like that. And I also wanted to reflect the fact that security should be more than just about states, but about individuals as well. So I just thought that captured it better than if I had used a term like peace. Second issue of hegemony, it was quite a difficult one to come to terms with. Leadership I could have used or something like that, but it's less sexy, than hegemony. Hegemony tends to have a very provocative sense to it, and people tend to actually see it in terms of domineering, countries throwing their weight around and dominating others. But hegemony I use in the sense of a country which is actually able to provide leadership based on capacity and having values that other countries want to follow. And the example of the US, for example, in providing a security cover for Europe, or providing Marshall aid, for example, or setting up institutions like the World Bank and IMF, that's the sort of hegemony that I'm talking about. And I wanted to capture it both in the regional sense of the role that Nigeria and South Africa have played in first accounting for about 75% of their regional economies in West and Southern Africa, and then playing a peacemaking role in the case of Nigeria and Liberia and Sierra Leone, in the case of South Africa, in DRC largely, and partly in Burundi. But then I had to look at the external players as well, China, France, and the US, because they are also playing a role even as these regional leaders are trying to assert their own leadership. And I thought hegemony would capture that, particularly in the role that France played, which I haven't focused on here at all. But I go into a lot of detail in the book about the way France played a role as a pyromaniac fireman, an arsonist, basically. Over 40 years. France would just go in and they launched over 40 interventions in Africa, sometimes getting rid of regimes they didn't like. In one case in 1979, even flying in a president, David Dacko, in the Central African Republic to replace Emperor Bokassa. So it's trying to capture these sorts of actions. And of course the role that the US played during the Cold War was also one where they were supporting dictators like Mobutu and Samuel Doe and Siad Barre. And even after the Cold War, I argue that Clinton changed the rhetoric, but they didn't much change the support of autocrats in Africa, in places like Ethiopia, Eritrea, Uganda, Rwanda. And then you had during the Bush period a kind of war on terror, where in the Cold War, anti-communism was what the client states had to use to gain support, and it seemed as if anti-terrorism became a much bigger sort of factor after the Cold War, with the US establishing, they have 2,000 troops in Djibouti They've established all sorts of different task forces for waging anti-terrorism, and civil libertarians in Africa have complained about anti-terrorism legislation that governments in Africa have been pressured into passing, which basically are used to clamp down on domestic dissent in some cases. So I thought I wanted a term that sort of captured all of that. And unity sounded better to me in terms of like just trying to find a new Pan-Africanism. And I guess my main argument here is that whereas Pan-Africanism in, you know, the Cold War period was about decolonization, political decolonization, and freeing Africa. And here I think you have to give the African leaders credit, because no matter how badly they governed their countries or disagreed with each other, the one issue that they pursued relentlessly at the OAU, at the UN, at the non-aligned movement was the political decolonization and liberation of Angola and Mozambique and Namibia and South Africa. And I think in this current age, our generation now has to focus on economic or socio-economic decolonization. Hence the focus on regional integration, and hence the focus on trying to look at what lessons we may learn from the European Union in terms of applying it to the African Union. Because you can't argue that many states in Africa can basically disappear from the map. You know, a Benin, a Togo, a Burkina Faso can disappear from the map just with an eraser without people worrying too much. They don't make sense as nation states because they can't produce, no matter how good the leadership is, the economies of scale to be able to industrialize without actually harnessing their efforts to larger markets. And so in the European context, a Luxembourg and a Belgium aren't very important, but within the European Union framework, they at least can find their own place. And the whole economic viability becomes less important. So those are some of the issues and reasons why I chose to go through those things.
Very good. So why don't we open the floor to a few questions. If you want to introduce yourself so that Professor Adebajo will know 1, 2, 3, and then we'll keep going.
My name is Bernard Londoni. I'm also a student here at ICA, a master's student. I would say thank you very much for your presentation, and I'm originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Oh, fantastic.
And so I love the way you portray the issue of security in Africa. So I was wondering if you could see what is happening in West Africa today. My worry is that I see that in a couple of years, Africa is going to be brought into this so-called global war on terror, with events developing in West Africa, where you see a lot of Western companies that are operating in Mali, Niger, and there are a lot of kidnappings taking place in that region, which you see that the Western companies or government are being more concerned with the security of their people, in the sense that our capacity there to protect, to create even security for the region is weaker. But we tend more to go toward this thing of global war and terror. So do you think that could be something that is going to be a big problem for West Africa and probably maybe the entire continent? And then the second question would be on the fracture of Africa in terms of, I always think that, without peace and security, sometimes democracy is ultimately weak. And so we see that in some part of Africa, like today, if you look at a country like Sudan, the northern and South Sudan, people, especially nations outside Africa, are advocating more for this secession between the South and the North. And I just don't see how it's going to develop in the next month and years when that happens. But I don't think if they are considering all the problems that will arise when the secession happens, if it's going to happen. And so do you think there is this sense of, again, we are being influenced more by outsiders than trying to figure out ourselves what is best for the continent?
Professor Cruz,
yeah, trying to introduce myself. Do you think that current national identity and intergroup relations in South Africa reflect vision of Mandela?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, where South Africa is hidden now in terms of intergroup relations and national identity?
I'm Samuel Johnson. Please don't call me Samuel because that reminds me of my mother. Call me Sam. I'm from Liberia. I'm a doctoral student. All right, just to go back on your point on hegemony, and as I speak about that, I would like to commend you for ascribing some role of African leaders to the current crisis on the continent, especially the use of the term agency. And I'm happy about that because it's very hard for me to find an academic or an African intellectual who would say that.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Many of my friends beat me up. Yeah, and you can understand it from the context of independence and the kind of relationships that leaders on the continent built, like the case of Cote d'Ivoire. I don't want to speak to Liberia, but Cote d'Ivoire, it was clear, Houphouët Boigny owed his allegiance to France. And so leaders themselves feathered their nets through the means of their colonial powers to build what I call a form of central periphery in their own countries. And so over time, you see it extending to security relations. In the present case, you see the case of the US and China as donors on the continent, but they are also taking a lot of interest in the security domain on the continent. Go back to the case of Liberia. The US is now the biggest funder of security reform. So how do you look at that particular trend as it affects the domestic policies vis-a-vis the intercontinental relationships on the continent?
Okay. In terms of the war on terror, the question from my brother at the back there, I talked a little bit about that. I do think that it is something that we really need to worry about. And it's not just the Al-Qaeda, in North Africa and West Africa, but Al-Shabaab in Somalia and the Horn of Africa. Islamists have always played a role in North African states like Egypt and elsewhere. And I think the way that the US is engaging with Africa, first of all, 85% of its trade is largely oil and largely with a handful of states, Nigeria, Angola, South Africa, I think Gabon account for most of its trade. The rest of the relationship, despite a lot of rhetoric and hot air, seems to be focused on its security interests. And this idea of AFRICOM that Donald Rumsfeld came up with during the Bush era. And the idea is actually one that's sensible on the face of it, in that they've always handled Africa through the European Command, and so they want to make Africa like the rest of the world, basically have its own command. But the problem is that the way that they've defined this has very clearly and transparently been about the war on terror that they wish to engage in and run on the Horn of Africa in particular, and all of these task forces that have been set up in North Africa and to cover West and East Africa, etc. And so you have a sort of militarization and securitization of US policy towards Africa, where Africa is seen in terms of a threat to US global interests, and they react accordingly. And when there was a lot of criticism of Africa, I think it was only the Liberian president, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, that was encouraging them to come and set up a base in Liberia. It was widely rejected by a lot of other Africans, and they defined it in a very, kind of vague way. It was to help African security interests, it was to promote governance in Africa, but it was very transparently not about African security interests, but about US security interests. So I do think that we have cause for concern And as much as Obama may have a nice smile, he's still institutionally in charge of a country that's continuing those policies. I mean, they haven't come out and kind of tried to establish a full-fledged AFRICOM, but they do still have 2,000 troops on the Horn of Africa. They are still firing missiles into killing, targets that they identified in Somalia. And they did encourage Ethiopia rather disastrously to invade Somalia, I think at the end of 2006, 2007, which they withdrew from after a year. So I do think that we need to be worried, despite our brother being in the White House. And you only need to look at what's going on in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where more people have been killed, and this includes innocent women and children, in a year, in Obama's first year, than during a similar period by Bush, to know that, even people that may have good intentions may face institutional constraints in terms of doing the right thing. So I do think we need to be skeptical and we need to be vigilant. South Sudan is an interesting case. It's Africa's largest country geographically, a sort of legacy of British colonial engineering where they ruled the north separately from the south, and the south was largely Christian and the north largely Muslim, and they kept missionaries out of the north so that identities became formed, and a lot of the leadership in Khartoum also see themselves as Arabs before they see themselves as African. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for Sudan to split into two countries, because I think that the government in Khartoum has often played a very irresponsible role in launching jihad and committing atrocities, not just in the south, but throughout much of the country, in southern Côte d'Ivoire, in Blue Nile, in Darfur, in other parts of the country. And, forcibly trying to convert people into a different religion, to Islamize them, and to prevent them from practicing their own religion, and trying to put them down, is something that I don't think is a very sensible approach. Thank you very much. So I think if South Sudan splits, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Only Eritrea has managed to do so in the post-independence era, and that was after a 30-year war in which the government in Addis Ababa agreed with that in Asmara, although within a few years they were fighting a bloody war with each other, which resulted in over 100,000 casualties. Sudan is a very dangerous situation in that the government in Khartoum only agreed to a referendum effectively under tremendous pressure by the US, especially because the religious right saw this as a Christian sort of minority in the south being oppressed by a Muslim majority in the north, and pushed the Bush administration to pressure Khartoum to kind of do something about it. And Khartoum reluctantly agreed to self-determination, even though they agreed they would try to make unity attractive. If there's a referendum in January, this January 2011, there's no doubt about it that the majority will vote to break away from the north. The question is whether a referendum will be held, whether it will be credible, and whether the north will allow the south to break away, and what the international community would do if chaos erupts. The UN has 10,000 troops in South Sudan. It has 26,000 troops in Darfur. And I think the key actors are the US, which can put a lot of pressure on Khartoum, as well as China, which buys much of Sudan's oil. And that's what one is going to need. A lot of the guarantors of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005, both at the global level and then at the IGAD level regionally, and the AU playing a very important diplomatic and military role if necessary to make sure that the outcome of a referendum is respected and that a credible referendum is held. In terms of national identity, intergroup identity, and Mandela in South Africa, I mean, Mandela has his place among the pantheon of leaders, not just in Africa, but in the 20th century. I think he was one of the greatest moral leaders in the world, and which is why a lot of other leaders beat a hasty retreat to his door. I mean, I remember Clinton in the middle of the Lewinsky scandal, with Mandela kind of being comforted by him at his hour of need. And I think having spent 27 years in jail and come out and preached reconciliation and helped to heal a divided nation and avoid what was probably an inevitable civil war between black and white, he deserves all the credit that he can get. But I think there's a school of thought increasingly that's raising questions about whether Mandela didn't play the role of the kind of prophet of the nation who offered abolition to whites without actually getting them to make a proper confession. And I'm sure Andrea, as a good Catholic, will understand what I'm talking about here. So you have in South Africa now the most unequal society in the world. They've overtaken Brazil again. You have a lot of white South Africans now talking boldly and accusing blacks of racism without actually realizing that a lot of them benefited directly from apartheid, whether they supported it or not, in terms of just education and amenities and housing, etc. So there's a sort of distortion that's going on in South Africa, in my view, where they're not talking openly and honestly about race. They're not reversing directly the socio-economic inequalities that have stretched back even way before apartheid. I mean, you have 350 years of racial domination by whites in South Africa that is not being reversed, and yet the poverty of the intellectual debate there is absolutely incredible, and the sort of way that people distort identities and talk about affirmative action as if, you know, whites are now like being oppressed, etc. So I do think that some of Mandela's and Desmond Tutu's Rainbow Nation has distorted the realities in South Africa, and there's more rhetoric, and people outside of South Africa are very pleased with the TRC and it's a model for them. But within South Africa itself, both whites and blacks really raise a lot of questions about whether the Truth and Reconciliation Commission achieved anything in terms of lasting reconciliation and getting a recognition of the suffering of blacks during apartheid itself. In terms of the kind of, I mean, there's a sort of, the ANC has always seen as false consciousness, the sort of ethnic politics that we would talk about in Nigeria or Uganda or Liberia as false consciousness. But yet, under Mbeki and Mandela, both were Xhosas. You know, the Xhosas are from the Eastern Cape. They got missionary education very early, and they've tended to dominate the African National Congress. Zuma is a Zulu, and he's the first non-Xhosa to have come into power. And there are all sorts of murmurs about like the Zulufication of the security position. They've neglected and betrayed Liberia, even though it was founded by freed black American slaves, and there has always been a connection, and they had strategic communications equipment and provided $500 million to Samuel Doe during the Cold War. The US effectively abandoned Liberia, both during the First Civil War in the 1990s, and then even in the 2003 conflict before Charles Taylor left. Everybody was expecting the US to go in. And there's a sort of naivety and a kind of national masochism about Liberians wanting Uncle Sam to kind of help them, but it's a kind of schizophrenic thing where Uncle Sam doesn't take them seriously, but people like Ellen Sirleaf Johnson and others keep looking to the US, despite the sacrifices that a lot of these regional actors like Nigeria and others have played. In 2003, when Monrovia was going to burn down, it was Nigerian troops that were sent there. And I recently watched a documentary where even Michael Francis, the respected Archbishop, was kind of saying they wanted the US, and if they can't get the US, they wanted the EU. And there's a kind of delusionment among Liberians about external actors. I do think, having said that though, that the US played an important role in making sure that there was a UN peacekeeping force in Liberia, as long as they didn't have to contribute troops to it. And within the UN Security Council, you kind of have countries like the US adopt Liberia, the Brits adopt Sierra Leone, and the French adopt Cote d'Ivoire, and they kind of carry on some of these spheres of influence. But I think one shouldn't always, in the French case, I agree that the French role is very big in Cote d'Ivoire, and they still have 4,600 troops there alongside the UN. But in the Liberia case, they may be contributing to security sector reform, but I would not exaggerate the role of the US. I think a lot of what's happening in Liberia, and Ellen Sirleaf Johnson is, I think, very smartly trying to diversify also to go to China and look at other countries that can help invest in Liberia. And I think that's the way it's got to be. We've got to be clever about courting some of these great powers, not relying on any one in particular, and using the fact that China has become the second largest economy in the world and the third largest investor in Africa, and is prepared to invest in some of the infrastructure, the railways, the roads, etc., that the West is not prepared to invest in. But we mustn't also be naive about China in that it's also pursuing its own self-interest very narrowly, and is sending 80,000 Chinese workers to Africa rather than producing jobs for Africans, or sending arms to different regimes of very autocratic nature. Those are the sorts of things we need to speak out on. But there's no reason why we can't be clever enough to use China's interest in Africa to diversify our dependence beyond the traditional colonial powers.
Okay. Michel, I'm from Canada. I spent maybe 3 years in Africa, most of the time in DRC. I'm finishing up my master's here. I'm just thinking lately of a concept where it seems to me that the time continuum for Africa sort of stopped when the colonialists came in. They disrupted the normal evolution of Africa. And now when independence came, well, the leaders basically learned how the colonialists worked and just replicated a system. So it seems to me that Africa hasn't really been on its own evolution path. Now I'm wondering, I think it's the outside influence is really the major key of how things are disrupted and why we're having conflict. I mean, it's normal in normal evolution process. If you look at democracies, they've been in conflict, and the US has been in a civil war as well. So I'm wondering if what your thoughts are, if the outside influence basically stops, will Africa begin its normal evolution?
She had her hand up. Go ahead, Maria. Mine is actually a variation of Professor Korstelina's and Ashad's, so it may get answered in the process of addressing his.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm Anne. I'm an ICAR student here, and I'm in Professor Korstelina's APT class, so we're going to Cape Town and studying these issues of national identity and intergroup relations. And first, I just wanted to comment that I love the way that you took so many different concepts for us and wove them into something that was a conceptual framework that I could really understand at a much deeper level with very colorful wording, but I also couldn't help but wondering what kinds of opinions you might actually express if you didn't hold back so much. My question was really sort of looking at it from a different perspective from Ashad's, and just wondering the same sort of thing. What would the identity look like, not from the perspective so much of academics or leaders, But from the general population, is there a homogeneous or a more heterogeneous sentiment about what they desire for their nation state? And I won't elaborate on the context for my question because I know we're running out of time.
Okay.
We have the last one.
Okay, it's relatively simple. Martha Cooper, master's student here. I'm just wondering, you mentioned 2 women leaders, but I'm wondering about,
Who was the second?
well, you mentioned the opposition leader who, because she's white, can't.
Oh,
can't.
yes.
So you've mentioned 2, but I'm wondering if you could comment more about the role of women in this whole process.
Okay. Was that good or bad that I mentioned the 2?
Well, I'm delighted because that's the first 2 women, I mean, women at all that you mentioned. And
We women need to speak up more, don't we? So he'll mention
Okay,
this more.
it's mostly a story of men messing up, which has been happening for the last 500 years, I guess. Okay, I think those are all excellent questions. On the sort of state that we want, you know, African states are always being given colorful names like the vampire state and the kleptocratic state, etc. I think you need an able state in Africa, one that can obviously provide social services to its population and provide employment, and move beyond the sort of Berlin curse of just exporting raw materials, as we've been doing since those systems were set up. And one thing Hillary Clinton noted when she came to Africa last year is that we're the only region of the world where less than 10% of the trade is between the countries themselves. Now, I know that that's not easy to achieve. You need leaders that have vision. You need leaders that sort of know where they want to go. A lot of leaders in Africa, unfortunately, are very good at the survival of the regime and keeping themselves in power. They're not building states. They're into regime survival. So what I would argue is exactly that, and that's how I'm sort of suggesting that we come out of the curse of Berlin through more effective regional integration, where countries are trading more effectively with each other, producing finished goods rather than just exporting raw materials. And most importantly, as a report by Adebajo, who set up a lot of the regional integration schemes in Africa, has argued. He did an audit of the AU in 2007, and one of the things he pointed out is that Africans have created so many integration schemes, dozens of them, many of which they don't fund properly, many of which are moribund, and it's important that we rationalize all of these institutions so that you have 8 RECs. That's a decision the African Union itself has made, that you need 8 regional economic communities and no more than that. But at the moment, they haven't actually implemented that. And Berlin is a metaphor. I mean, it's easy for academics that are in ivory towers to call for a redrawing of boundaries. Of course, it's not going to happen, at least in the short term, because political elites don't give up territories, typically. You know, I've talked about the cases under which they've typically happened. So I think what I'm talking about more is more effective regional integration in the short term, rather than focusing on a redrawing of the borders. And of course, the internal nation states themselves need to be governed in such a way that they can actually be viable economic entities, as I'm talking about, because there needs to be something to integrate for economic integration to actually be effective. But I think part of what you've seen here is that my background is Africa's international relations. I've looked at Africa's international relations after the Cold War, and so I've tended to look more at what states do with each other rather than within states themselves. That's been the focus of the book. But I take your points. Gaddafi's role, I mean, he's given himself now the honorific title of the King of Kings, and he brings all of these colorfully dressed traditional leaders together, and he has the money to be able to do it. But I don't think that contributes in any way to building of traditional institutions or local governments, or trying to get a sense of what the division should be between the rural and the urban. Some of the really important issues that we need to be addressing in Africa. And Gaddafi's vision of Pan-Africanism, his United States of Africa, sort of borrows from Nkrumah in calling for monetary union, in calling for common security, in calling even for cabinet ministers that can have portfolios, you know, and a dilution of sovereignty. But you know, you have to raise questions about somebody who doesn't have a parliament at home and is trying to promote some of these ideas and to bid to host the Pan-African Parliament itself. So I think you do have a sort of disconnect between Gaddafi promoting himself as a leader in Africa, and he has tremendous oil resources that he uses to buy off states. And he's traditionally always done that to buy influence. But I don't think it really amounts to much in terms of, you know, raising the level of traditional institutions and actually promoting viable integration in Africa. On aid, my brother there, I'm presuming you're not Tigrayan, but
I'm an Oromo from
you're an Oromo. Fantastic.
I do.
I agree.
Struggling for quite some time.
Yeah.
I agree with your basic point. I think it's quite dangerous when Western donors provide 50% budget support to autocrats in Rwanda and Ethiopia and don't really hold their feet to the fire in terms of holding sham elections. And I think they've just turned their glare away. You know, Ethiopia is considered too important an actor on the Horn of Africa. As I said earlier, the US encouraged it to invade Somalia in 2007 before it withdrew troops there. It shares military intelligence with the US, and those sorts of things are seen as too important when the US and other Western powers see, you know, terrorists on the Horn of Africa. They want linchpins that can actually help them in that regard. So for better or for worse, those are the calculations that have been made. But I agree with you that internal governance needs to be taken more seriously before supporting these sorts of regimes. But it's not just Ethiopia. It's many other regimes within the region. And I think we need to look at Paul Kagame in Rwanda, who is regularly winning elections by awarding himself over 90% of the polls. And there are several of them that continue to be given assistance as, you know, blue-eyed boys of the West. The intriguing question about what would happen if outside intervention were to stop. We unfortunately don't have the choice of autarky, of just delinking from the world system. Whether we like it or not, the world system is going to shape us. So I think, as I argued in relation to China, it's more a matter of trying to be clever enough to actually define what our own interests are and how to use some of those, because, you know, we don't have the technology even to be able to take out the resources under the ground in our countries. So there's no way you can just call for a sort of total disengagement of outside actors. You've got to actually try to formulate policies that benefit you by playing off some of those outside actors with each other. You know, the complaint of the US, for example, in Angola, that every time we try to pressure Angola, China writes a check. Now, I may not like the corruption of the government in Luanda, and I certainly don't, but that's leverage. But many countries have not actually developed policies to be able to take advantage of not just the countries, but the institutions like the UN and others that exist to promote their own interests in an effective way. And since many of these African countries are so small, they need to do it actually on a regional basis, and then led by countries like your South Africas and Nigerias, which can, because of their size and population weight, etc., can actually act as drivers or motors of economic integration. And it's not unusual. It's the same role Germany plays in Europe, or Japan has played in Southeast Asia, etc. But I think the historical puzzle is, with the exception of maybe a Japan, with its Meiji Restoration and borrowing from, administration in France, military techniques in Germany, there are not many other countries that have actually been able to modernize without just westernizing. And at the moment, we're mimic men that are just mimicking Western development rather than trying to take the best from everywhere and adapt it to our own local circumstances. That's been the missing link for me that we haven't really been able to do. But I don't think we really have a choice. We have to engage, and there are other countries that were colonized in Asia that have been able to get out of colonization, like your South Koreas and others, and have been able to actually develop policies based on very strong education or promoting national champions, but at least having a vision to be able to know where you're going and being able to use, whether it's the presence of Japan or the larger Asian market or a US security link, to be able to achieve what you want to achieve. But I do think you need some lead states in Africa to be able to anchor that process. The other question was about, I think it was about maybe what do populations think rather than elites, is effectively how I understood that.
Yes.
In civil society is still quite weak, but there are many courageous examples of civil society all over Africa. In Liberia, for example, civil society has contributed to, integrating demobilized soldiers or fighters back into local communities. They've been involved in developing early warning systems in places like IGAD in East Africa and ECOWAS in West Africa, and trying to promote governance and even getting rid of military governments. And these were women in Sierra Leone in 1996. Women civil society groups played a very important role. Obviously Africa is quite a diverse place, and it has 54 countries. So there are some places where populations can influence things more than others. South Africa has a very well-developed civic culture and a strong judiciary and a fairly strong press, although I would question the diversity sometimes of its views. But there are many countries that don't have those same checks and balances. And there are many countries where elections are still able to be manipulated, like your Ugandas and Nigeria. I mean, they determine the result before the election is actually held. So, the will of the people isn't necessarily reflected in what the leaders are doing, and the people aren't necessarily able to influence the leaders through the ballot box, and there's still many challenges. So it's a difficult question to answer in sort of one go. I guess it depends on where you're talking about, I would say. But there are strong civil society voices in several of these countries that have played an important role, even under very oppressive systems. Even under the most oppressive military dictatorships in Nigeria, the press still remained extremely vibrant and continued to challenge. So that is some sense of hope, I guess, of a vox populi. The role of women, I'm glad I did mention 2 women. I hope I didn't come across as sexist, though, because I wasn't too praising of both of those women. And one of the problems I have with the head of state of Liberia is she can't really tie her headgear very well. So a lot of Nigerian women and others complain about it. But seriously, I shouldn't be flippant about such
That's the problem you don't have.
Women continue to play a very important role in places like West Africa, Liberia and Sierra Leone. Even before Ellen Sirleaf Johnson came to power, there was another very prominent and indomitable Liberian woman who actually led the interim government and the process that eventually led to elections, Ruth Perry, in Liberia. And I've talked about the role Sierra Leonean women have played. In the Great Lakes, women have a lot of civil society groups on the ground in very difficult places like Kivu, etc., and are trying their best to kind of limit some of the atrocities and get help to people there. So definitely, I mean, women are at least half of the population in Africa, and it just seems an incredible waste of resources and inefficiency not to take advantage of the capacity of half of your populations. But that is unfortunately the case in many African countries. And even in terms of parliament, there's a debate now of whether to establish quotas in various countries, like 30% or whatever, and reserve seats for women. But you do still have many patriarchal societies that are culturally prejudiced towards even having and seeing women in leadership positions.
We are way beyond the time that we were allotting ourselves, but I want to make sure that everybody is joining me in thanking Adebajo for being with us. Is coming to us after speaking to a group of 40 African ambassadors and representatives at the United Nations, because as you can easily imagine, the consequences of a book like this and the consequences of Alice Mazrui legacy are for the whole continent quite spectacular. And I think that these are conversations where clearly you see something new emerging and something old coming together. I must admit that when I read Ali's mention of the ancestors being upset, I was intrigued, because there is something beautiful about reclaiming these legacies, you know, reclaiming something very deep, very profound, and then relaunching it in this collective enterprise that says, you know what, okay, there is a curse, it was in Berlin. We were divided and we were forced into political boundaries that do not necessarily represent us, but this process of representation is now on us. And this is not just external institution that needs to come together, it's really a coming together of a continent, and we believe that a book like this is definitely a step in the right direction. So, thank you.